The number didn't make sense. It sat there quietly on the statement, printed in the same font as everything else, aligned perfectly within the structure of the page, as if it belonged. As if it had always been there. But it hadn't. That much was certain. The monthly HOA fee, something that had remained stable for years, something predictable and almost forgettable in its consistency, had changed overnight. And not by a small margin. It had more than doubled. There was no warning. No notice tucked into an envelope. No email explaining upcoming changes. No meeting announcement hinting at a vote or a decision. Nothing that suggested this was coming. Just a new number, sitting where the old one used to be, demanding attention in a way that felt almost deliberate. At first, the mind searched for the simplest explanation. A mistake. That was always the easiest answer. A clerical error. A system glitch. A miscalculation buried somewhere in the billing process. Something that would correct itself once it was noticed. Something temporary. But the longer the statement was examined, the less likely that explanation became. Everything else looked perfect. Every line item was formatted correctly. Every detail aligned with previous statements. There were no irregularities, no inconsistencies, no signs that anything had gone wrong. The document carried the same precision it always had. Which meant this wasn't an accident. It had been entered intentionally. That realization didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like a weight that grew heavier the longer it stayed. Because if it wasn't a mistake, then it was a decision. And decisions like this don't happen without reason. The problem was, there was no visible reason. The neighborhood hadn't changed. The streets looked the same as they always had. Clean, quiet, maintained just enough to meet expectations but not enough to suggest anything new or improved. The landscaping hadn't been upgraded. The sidewalks hadn't been repaired. The shared spaces showed no signs of recent investment. Everything looked exactly as it had before. Which made the increase feel disconnected. Unjustified. The statement didn't offer any answers. It simply presented the number and moved on, as if explanation wasn't necessary. As if the presence of the fee alone was enough to validate it. That silence carried meaning. Because when a system that once explained itself suddenly stops, it usually means one of two things. Either the explanation is too complicated. Or it's something that isn't meant to be seen. The thought lingered longer than expected. At first, it was easy to push it aside. To assume that there would be clarification soon. That someone would address it. That an explanation would follow in the next update or meeting. But time has a way of reinforcing uncertainty when answers don't appear. And the absence of communication began to feel intentional. Days passed, and nothing changed. No notices arrived. No corrections were issued. The number remained exactly where it had been, unchanged, unquestioned, at least by the system that had placed it there. That was when the perspective shifted. Because the longer something goes unaddressed, the less it feels like an oversight and the more it feels like expectation. The HOA wasn't correcting the number. It was waiting for it to be accepted. That realization created a different kind of tension. Not loud or immediate, but steady. Persistent. The kind that builds slowly, reinforcing itself with each unanswered question. The statement was reviewed again. Line by line. Each category examined more carefully than before. Maintenance fees. Administrative costs. Reserve contributions. Everything was there, just as it had always been, but slightly adjusted. Not drastically. Just enough. Each section had increased in a way that seemed small on its own. But together, they formed the larger number that now stood out so clearly. It wasn't one change. It was many. And that made it more difficult to challenge. Because multiple small adjustments are harder to question than one large one. They blend in. They feel less significant. Less noticeable. But when combined, they create something much larger. Something intentional. That pattern raised a new question. Had this been happening for longer than it seemed? The previous statements were pulled for comparison. Month by month. At first glance, the changes were subtle. Almost invisible. A slight increase here. A minor adjustment there. Nothing that would have stood out on its own. But when viewed together, across time, the pattern became clear. The increase hadn't happened overnight. It had been building. Quietly. Gradually. And the current statement wasn't the beginning. It was the result. That realization changed everything. Because it meant the system hadn't just made a sudden decision. It had been moving in this direction for a while. Adjusting, testing, increasing in small increments that went largely unnoticed. Until now. And once something like that becomes visible, it's difficult to ignore. The focus shifted from the number itself to the reason behind it. Because numbers don't exist on their own. They represent choices, decisions, actions taken by someone, somewhere within the structure of the system. And those actions leave traces. The question was no longer whether the increase was real. It was why it had happened. And more importantly, where the money was going. That question didn't demand an immediate answer. But it demanded attention. Because when something changes without explanation, and continues without correction, it suggests that the explanation isn't missing. It's being withheld. And once that possibility takes hold, it becomes impossible to ignore. The statement was no longer just a bill. It was a starting point. The increase didn't exist in isolation. That realization settled in slowly, not as a sudden conclusion, but as a growing awareness that something larger had been unfolding long before the number on the statement demanded attention. Because systems, especially ones built on routine and structure, rarely change without leaving traces behind. They shift gradually, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until the change becomes too large to ignore. And this change felt like the end of a process, not the beginning of one. The HOA had not always felt like this. There had been a time when everything seemed straightforward, predictable. The rules were clear, the fees were stable, and the purpose behind each charge was visible in the condition of the neighborhood itself. Clean streets, maintained landscaping, functional shared spaces. There was a sense that the system, while sometimes strict, at least justified its presence. It created order. And for a while, that order made sense. But over time, something subtle began to shift. Not in a way that drew immediate attention, but in a way that could only be recognized in hindsight. The communication that once accompanied decisions started to fade. Updates became less frequent. Explanations became shorter, less detailed, and eventually, almost non-existent. The structure remained. But the transparency didn't. At first, it didn't seem like a problem. There was an assumption that everything was still functioning as intended. That the absence of explanation didn't mean the absence of reason. That somewhere, behind the scenes, decisions were still being made with the same level of care and accountability. That assumption held, until the details began to matter. Small inconsistencies started appearing. They were easy to overlook at first. Minor adjustments in fees that didn't quite align with visible changes in services. Slight increases in categories that had previously remained stable. Administrative costs that seemed to expand without clear purpose. Individually, they meant very little. But collectively, they formed a pattern. A pattern that suggested something was changing, not in the neighborhood itself, but in the way it was being managed. The difference was subtle, but important. Because when a system begins to change internally, without reflecting those changes externally, it creates a disconnect. A gap between what is being charged and what is being delivered. And that gap is where questions begin. The HOA meetings, once a source of information, had also changed. Attendance had decreased over time. Participation had become less active. The meetings themselves, while still held regularly, seemed to move faster, covering decisions with less discussion, less scrutiny. Important updates were summarized instead of explained. It created an environment where decisions existed, but understanding did not. And in that environment, authority becomes easier to exercise without challenge. Because without clear information, there is nothing to question. That realization didn't come immediately. It built slowly, reinforced by each small detail that didn't quite fit. Each moment where something felt slightly off but not significant enough to confront. Each instance where a question formed, but didn't fully take shape. Until now. Because the fee increase forced everything into focus. It turned those small inconsistencies into something larger. Connected them in a way that made them impossible to ignore. What once seemed like isolated details now looked like steps in a sequence. A progression. And that progression suggested intent. The numbers on the statement were no longer just numbers. They were evidence. Evidence of a system that had been adjusting itself over time, gradually shifting away from transparency and toward something else, something less visible, less accountable. The more that thought developed, the more it reshaped the way everything was viewed. The neighborhood itself hadn't changed. But the system governing it had. And that difference mattered. Because it meant the issue wasn't about maintenance or improvements. It wasn't about rising costs or necessary upgrades. If those things had been the cause, they would have been visible. They would have been communicated. Instead, the changes existed only in the numbers. And that raised a more serious concern. that the purpose of those numbers had also changed. The previous statements were reviewed again, but this time with a different perspective. Not just looking for differences, but looking for patterns. Tracing the increases back further. Examining each category more closely. Identifying where the changes began, and how they evolved over time. What emerged was subtle, but consistent. Certain categories increased more frequently than others. Administrative costs, in particular, showed a steady upward trend. Maintenance fees fluctuated slightly, but not in ways that aligned with actual work being done. Reserve funds increased, but without any visible projects that would require such growth. It wasn't random. It was structured. And that structure suggested planning. Because unplanned changes tend to be uneven. They fluctuate, respond to external factors, adjust based on need. But this pattern was different. It was controlled. Measured. Deliberate. It moved in one direction. Upward. That realization added weight to the situation. Because it meant the current increase wasn't an anomaly. It was the result of a system that had been moving toward this point for some time. Quietly. Without attention. And perhaps, without expectation that it would ever be fully examined. The thought raised another question. Why now? Why had the increase reached this level? Why had the gradual adjustments suddenly become so significant? The answer wasn't immediately clear. But the timing suggested something. That whatever had been building behind the scenes had reached a stage where subtlety was no longer enough. That the system required more funds, more flexibility, more control. And to achieve that, it needed to take a larger step. The statement was that step. A shift from gradual increase to noticeable change. From quiet adjustment to visible demand. And once that step was taken, it changed the dynamic completely. Because subtle changes can go unnoticed. But significant ones invite attention. And attention leads to questions. The HOA, whether intentionally or not, had crossed a threshold. It had moved from a system that operated quietly to one that demanded explanation. And the absence of that explanation became the most important detail of all. Because when a system expects compliance without providing clarity, it reveals something about its priorities. It shows that maintaining control has become more important than maintaining trust. And once that shift occurs, the foundation of the system begins to weaken. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because trust, once questioned, doesn't return easily. The frustration didn't come from the money alone. It came from the silence around it. There was no explanation, no breakdown, no reason given for why the fees had suddenly increased so dramatically. The absence of communication made the situation feel less like a decision, and more like something being hidden. That feeling changed everything. The focus shifted from the amount to the intention behind it. Because numbers don't just appear, they are placed there by someone. And when those numbers stop making sense, it usually means the reasoning behind them isn't meant to be seen easily. The more the statements were reviewed, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a recent change. It had been building over time. Small increases, scattered across different categories, slowly raising the total without drawing attention. Until now. That realization created a different kind of pressure. Not emotional, but logical. A need to understand the system behind the numbers. Because once a pattern is visible, it becomes impossible to ignore. And once ignored patterns become visible, they lead to one thing. Questions. The moment the question was raised, it stopped being personal. It became shared. Others began to notice the same increases, the same inconsistencies, the same lack of explanation. Statements were compared. Numbers were reviewed. What once felt isolated quickly revealed itself as a wider issue. And that changed the balance. Because the HOA's authority had always relied on quiet acceptance. But once attention replaced assumption, that authority began to weaken. Not through confrontation, but through scrutiny. The numbers didn't align with reality. The services hadn't changed. The costs didn't match the visible condition of the neighborhood. And that gap became impossible to ignore. The issue moved into the open, not as an accusation, but as a question that demanded an answer. Where was the money going? And once that question existed publicly, it couldn't be contained. The answer didn't come immediately. It revealed itself gradually. Financial records, vendor payments, and internal allocations began to show patterns that didn't match normal operations. Certain companies appeared repeatedly. Costs were assigned without clear justification. And then the connection became visible. Some of those companies were linked, indirectly but clearly, to individuals within the HOA itself. Business ties, ownership overlaps, and repeated contracts pointed toward something more than coincidence. It wasn't mismanagement. It was intentional. The increased fees weren't being used for the neighborhood. They were being redirected. That realization changed everything. Because it meant the issue wasn't just about money. It was about control, and the misuse of it. The outcome didn't come from confrontation. It came from exposure. Once the connections were clear, the structure behind the fees couldn't be defended. The pattern of payments, the lack of transparency, and the conflicts of interest formed a complete picture. One that couldn't be ignored. The system was forced to respond. Changes followed. Oversight increased. The flow of money, once hidden behind vague categories, became visible and accountable. The excessive fees were corrected, and the structure that allowed them was dismantled. But the impact went beyond the numbers. It changed how the community viewed the HOA itself. Trust was no longer assumed. It had to be earned. And the lesson remained clear. When something doesn't make sense, there is always a reason. You just have to look closely enough to find it.